just get a little bit more radical in our conversation about what it means to follow the Lord. And to talk this evening about the call to leave everything behind to follow, to take a great and daring leap, to risk all for love, and to respond to what Brother Roger of Teze called the absolute of the call of the gospel, that absolute. So daring to risk all for love. And just to remind us that a kind of catchphrase that we probably keep returning to over the course of this series is this great quote of Gaudium et Spes, that man finds himself in a sincere gift of himself, that we as human beings find ourselves in giving ourselves away. That's what it is to be human, so we need to never forget this great quote. So I want us to talk a little bit about following Jesus in a radical way. And the life of Jesus himself, as we've talked about before, is characterised by self-giving. It's the whole pattern of the life of God who, upon entering our world and our flesh, has poured himself out in love, in the person, the life and the actions of Jesus. He's made of himself a gift. He has dared to love and to love with the whole of himself. And each one of us as disciples of Jesus, each one of us as human beings made for love, are called to follow in a wholehearted way. It's not an option for some who are zealous, it's for all of us to follow in a wholehearted way, to truly be the disciples of Jesus Christ. But what I want us to focus in on a little bit this evening is that particular calling, which is not made to all, but is made to some, to follow Jesus in a more specific and special way, and to live a life that is more explicitly the same as the life that Jesus himself lived on earth. That life of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And we call this the consecrated life, or religious life. Now I thought I'd have a visual aid for this evening, so I've got my PowerPoint, but I've also got Father Rod. Radiant example here of what we're going to be talking about. In the flesh. In the flesh. No pressure, Rod. No,
none at all.
So I want us to explore this evening the evangelical counsels. This is what they're called, the evangelical counsels: poverty, chastity, and obedience. This pattern of the life of Jesus. And I think that there might be a little temptation that's going on in a few people's minds around the room right now to go, aye, they're talking about religious life tonight. That's not for me, so I shall switch off at this point and have a gentle snooze for the rest of the evening. Wrong, because what we're talking about is the pattern of the life of Jesus. So the evangelical counsels, poverty, chastity and obedience, is relevant for every disciple of Jesus. We are all called to follow him wholeheartedly. But we need people to live it in a very particular way. And we're going to explore why this evening. And as the body of Christ, all of us need all of the vocations of the church. All of us need all of the vocations of the church. So as laity, we need the priests. As priests, we need families. As families, we need religious life. And so all of the vocations of the church are dependent upon one another because we're a body and we need all the parts of that body. So consecrated life, that we're going to explore in particular this evening, shows us something that every person in this room needs to see, needs to experience, needs to understand. So I worked a little bit in a school some years ago, and in RE classes, when they were talking about religious life, the students, in a Catholic school, of course, had absolutely no idea what was meant by religious life. They just thought that meant living a religious life. So just to clear that one up before we carry on, When I use the term consecrated life or religious life this evening, and I'll use it interchangeably, I'm referring to monks, nuns, brothers and sisters who have professed vows, okay, just to be clear, rather than us living a life that's quite religious. And there are a variety of kinds of orders and institutes and congregations throughout the world which express this calling to follow Jesus in a very radical way, in a whole diverse, many and diverse ways. But they're all consecrated to God in a special way, to live this radical life that Jesus himself lived. Now, when Father Nick Crowe came at the beginning of January to set the scene for this series of talks, and to introduce the kind of shape of vocation to us, he spoke about how different people are called to represent to the world of today a particular aspect of the life and mission of Jesus Christ. It's the idea of representing to the world some aspect of the life and mission of Jesus Christ. And he spoke about the kind of biblical models for this, that some people aren't actually called by Jesus to leave their home or their family in order to follow him, but they are called to be his disciples. And he said that that's more like the lay vocation. And he said there's another biblical pattern that we see, which is those men and women who were actually invited to leave their home and leave their existing lives and follow him and be alongside him and go with him where he went, and to imitate more closely his own way of life. And he said consecrated life or religious life has its origins in this model that we see in the Gospels of the special relationship established, that Jesus established with some of his disciples. That group who were with him in a more literal sense, who lived at his side, who had a greater intimacy with him, and who lived a life that was more like his own. So the consecrated life is a particular expression of the vocation that each one of us has as baptised Christians to follow Jesus and to become like him. So there's a wonderful document called Vita Consecrata, written by the fantastic Saint John Paul II, and he spoke about religious life as religious follow Jesus with all their hearts. He said that it's living and expressing. He said religious follow Jesus with their whole hearts, living and expressing this by conforming their whole existence to Christ, an all-encompassing commitment which foreshadows the eschatological perfection, or just to clear up that word there, eschatological kingdom or end times, the end goal of our lives, our existence. By professing the evangelical counsels, that was the poverty, chastity and obedience, consecrated persons not only make Christ the whole meaning of their lives, but they strive to reproduce in themselves as far as possible that form of life which he, as Son of God, accepted in entering into this world. So in a really profound and important sense, those who are called to the consecrated life are called to enable people to see Jesus in our world, in our context today. That's the mission of religious life. So the evangelical counsels, Jesus himself chose a way of life in which he was poor, celibate for the sake of the kingdom, and radically obedient to the will of the Father. So those called to consecrated life also embrace these three dimensions of the life of Jesus. But as Katie will tell you when she comes and gives a talk on marriage next week, the evangelical counsels are also a very, very real dimension of the married vocation too, but in a slightly different way. Now, this business of poverty, chastity and obedience, at a first glance, and I think probably for most of us and for most of our contemporaries and for most of our society and our world, it sounds very negative. It sounds like it's all about what we don't have, about not having something. not having sex, not having things, not having power or freedom. So it sounds like a rather brutal, negative kind of a reality, maybe a bit life-denying or life diminishing. But actually, if we understand these dimensions of the life of Jesus more fully, what we realise is that they are about a more complete having, of what really matters. So what is poverty in the Christian sense of a vow? And I'm not talking about imposed poverty. I'm not talking about the poverty of those who don't have homes and who don't have enough to eat. That's not the same idea. The theological idea of poverty. It's not a denial of the good of created things, but it's rather about renouncing private ownership and holding on to things in order to state more boldly with your life that your ultimate treasure is the kingdom. To embrace poverty is to let go of material stuff, because what you actually have and what you're gaining is infinitely more valuable. You're gaining faith, hope and love, the things that do not pass away in this life but which endure eternally. Chastity, or we'll call it celibacy for the kingdom, because married people are also called to chastity, and if that one baffles you, then ask Katie next week what chastity in marriage means. But celibacy for the kingdom is not a denial of sexuality or intimacy. It's not a denial of the goods of marriage or parenthood. It's actually a recognition and a manifestation of a deeper truth, the more complete intimacy that we have in the Trinity. It's about proclaiming with your sexuality that God is your ultimate lover, your spouse, the one that we are ultimately called to a total union with. And obedience is not a denial of personal freedom or responsibility, but rather a recognition of the true source of our freedom, God himself. And it's about embracing a close communion with him, recognising that we actually are called to live in a relationship of child to father, in loving interdependence. And it's a recognition that because God is the source of my freedom, his will is my ultimate joy. And so it's the embracing of a conformity of our own will to God's will, in which we find true freedom. Okay, now, so if it hasn't become super abundantly clear from this so far, what the point of religious life is, I thought I'd now spell it out in really plain ways. So, I think the first thing is that this kind of, the almost central mission of religious life is to make Jesus visible in the world in a very clear and bold way. Those characteristic features of Jesus who was poor, chaste and obedient. People in our world need to see Jesus. We, all of us in this room, need to see Jesus. And so religious life is absolutely vital. In a very special way, religious life makes plain to the whole church and the world the deepest vocation of the church and the deepest vocation of every Christian. Religious reveal that union with God as the deepest call of the church and of the human person. They make it very plain that we don't find our goal in this life or our fulfilment in the created things of this earth, good as those things are. But actually our end goal, our true goal, is the kingdom of God. And they do this by living that kingdom even now. They are those who have heard the absolute call of the gospel, and they choose to orient their lives towards it, so as to help all of us to orient our lives in the right direction. And it's for this reason that prayer is so important and essential to the life of a religious, in order to live that deep union with God, in order to really clearly point towards the ultimate fulfilment of our life in God that has begun now through baptism and through religious consecration. Religious also help to reveal the radical nature of God's love, that he loves us so profoundly to the very roots of our beings, that when we recognise this love and we abandon ourselves to it, we don't have a need to cling to anything for ourselves anymore. And so with St. Paul we're able to say, for the supreme advantage of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, I count everything else as rubbish. Religious are also called to be available for mission in a particular and special way, and available to love others in a more universal way, because they're not called to have their own family, but instead to love all as their family in the way that Jesus himself did. And finally, I think in all of these ways, the consecrated life gives all of us inspiration to be more wholehearted in our following of Jesus. So just to come to sort of a conclusion, I think there's a wonderful moment in the scriptures where Peter turns to Jesus, and it's the feast of the chariots of Peter. He's having a bit of a freak out, and he turns to the Lord and he says, Lord, we've left everything and followed you. You know, what are we going to get? What will we have? And I think that worry can be there for all of us, whatever the nets are that we're called to drop in order to follow the Lord. And they're quite significant when it's religious life that we're called to. So it's very real and very human to have that question, what am I going to get if I leave everything behind, or I have left everything behind? You know, what am I going to get? And Jesus amazingly replies, you will have 100 times as much in this life and in the next, eternal life. So there's a more that is given when all is renounced. More is given, more is received. Depth of intimacy in prayer with God. In a certain sense, a greater fulfilment of one's sexuality through celibacy for the kingdom, as paradoxical as that might sound. A different kind and perhaps more universal kind of parenthood. I think a sort of surprising provision for all one's needs in a whole range of areas, whether they're spiritual, emotional or material. So, at that point, you might in fact want to ask Father Rod for the details of what that something more is. So what I'm going to just do, we're just going to pause for a minute and chat with our neighbours, and I think there are a couple of questions. Okay, so just chat with your neighbours, and if you just want to have a conversation in threes, and then after that we're going to move into the next part of the evening where people's questions from last week, which I have here on post-it notes, we're going to grill Father Rod on. So have a chat in threes, and just if you can have a chat with your neighbours about in what ways you might be being invited in what ways are you being invited to live those dimensions of poverty, chastity and obedience fully in your lives? If you've begun to grasp what they mean, have a chat in threes. In what ways are you being invited to live poverty, chastity and obedience? Great. It's a great pleasure to be able to invite Father Rod down to Brighton. In the early days of our community life down here, Father Rod made a trip down about once a week. So, Father Rod came every Monday to the community for the first 2 years.
Trying to work out, Joe.
I know, yeah. Well, yeah, they'll be petitioning me now and then to bring it back. I thought I'd just give a little intro to Father Rod here, just a bit of background. So Father Rod was born in 1975. And before he became a monk, he studied contemporary dance at Loughborough University.
There's nothing funny about that.
Alongside his training in dance, he was part of. Oh no, I'm not going to hold it together. He was part of a band who rocketed to fame with a #1 hit in the Welsh charts. But that was their only hit. And then Father Rod entered the monastery and faded at that point into obscurity. Father Rod is an avid supporter of Crystal Palace football team. And he's got an unusual allergy to licorice. So that's my little bio. Good. Well, now that everybody knows everything about you.
It's true you were a dancer. Is it true you were a contemporary dancer?
Well, according to Jo.
But I mean.
Well, you can ask
me privately.
No, I think.
I want a video of your dance.
There was absolutely no reaction at all, Father Roger, you'll be pleased to say there when I said that you were born in 1975.
I reacted.
It was
internal.
1973.
Yeah.
Okay, now, everybody wonderfully... Sorry. Should I correct that part?
Yeah.
Father Rod entered the monastery in 1980, having studied at Brighton University in architecture, and was an architect. Father Rod is an avid fan of Brighton Hove Albion football team, and if you want to make him happy when it's not Lent, give him a stick of licorice. Okay, right, now moving on. So we gathered in some absolutely amazing questions last week from the group, for anyone who did a pink post-it note. There are many of them, so I mean we can either work our way through all of them, and you might make it back tomorrow morning for morning prayer, Father Rod, or we can just select a few.
Yeah.
So I think we'll select a few.
Yeah, select a few, Jo.
Okay,
Yeah.
Father Rod, I'm going to ease you in.
Okay.
We're going to start with a light one, and then we're going to build up quite quickly.
Okay.
Okay. How old were you when you realised you wanted to be a monk?
I was just working back now. 21, 20. I was about 23, I think. 22, 23, something like that. Yeah. I just finished my degree at Brighton, and I was. I had my first visit at that time to the Abbey. So it was about a year after that, I think. So it might have been about 23.
And Father, what was your biggest fear before you entered the monastery?
That it was a big mistake. Deluding myself. Yeah, of course, because you can never know for sure. Yeah. So I mean, the bigger. I mean, I just studied in 7 years of study, and then I decided to join a monastery. I mean, that's crazy, actually. Crazy. Just ready to go out and get stuck into a professional career. And you go and join a monastery. I mean, you can imagine what my father thought of that. So
You're
there you
not
are.
following that dance career.
So yeah. So yeah, I guess it's sort of, gosh, is this the right thing to do? You know, at that point. So there was reasons why I went ahead with it.
Yeah. Did the fears begin to, sort of disappear, or did they change shape as things went on?
I think it's about as I moved into that way of life was actually experience a deep sense that it was the right place to be.
Mm.
So whatever, I mean, there were times, that I wasn't, should I stay, should I go, sort of thing. Was it a song? What's a song?
Yeah, you could sit.
I can't sing it. I don't know. But there was that, particularly in those early years where it is about discerning.
Yeah.
But no, I wouldn't say I was fearful as much as just, is this the right thing? And the only way, I decided the only way to find out was to try it.
Yeah. And in monastic life, you join for a little bit. You're doing the novitiate for a year.
Yeah.
And then you take simple vows for.
So, is that meant to be? Is this meant to be? Okay,
So it's just disco lights.
Okay.
Getting us ready.
Yeah, you do. There's a process of a gradual immersion over time. So you don't sort of join the monastery and then within a week you've got to commit yourself to it. There is a process, because it's not only what I thought that the Lord was calling me to this way of life, but it's what the community also think.
Mm.
So you're entering into a relationship there. So it's got to be both what I feel the Lord is calling me to be, but that's also discerned with the community.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, they vote on you.
So they voted you in then?
They voted me in just that.
Yeah.
So there is, there is a process.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So next one up.
Yeah.
What do you find hardest about being a monk, and what's the best bit about being a monk?
What's hardest? Gosh, yeah. Oh, gosh, yeah. I think you'll always. I think every monk would probably say that. Obedience at times can be one of the hardest things, because you're not your own. You're no longer, once you join a community for life. And one of the interesting things about a monastery, which is different to if you met that rogue Nick Crow, the Dominican. Did you meet Nick? You met Nick, yeah. Well, see, Nick, as a Dominican, his way of life would take him from one community to another, and so on. As a monk, you stay in one place, generally speaking. You're committed to that community, that family. So there's a sense of being rooted, really having to be rooted. And part of that, very much for us, is living under obedience. And there are times when that can be a challenge, a real challenge. It can be over quite simple things at times. At other times, it can involve quite major decisions. Maybe you're being asked to take on something in a way of work or ministry which you don't feel particularly well equipped to do, so there are those challenges. So obedience can be quite a challenging, can be at times a very challenging experience. And was the other thing what I enjoyed most?
Yeah, what the best bit?
I would say I guess what drew me into the monastery was, you might say, well, you would say this really, but I would say that life of prayer, which in essence is that relationship that grows with the Lord, is what not sustains me in that way of life, and is I'm so privileged to have the opportunity to really spend that time in prayer in many different ways. And then the other thing is occasionally getting down to watch Brighton. That it doesn't happen often enough. But there we go. Yeah.
No, I think the next one might start to get more challenging.
Well, that was challenging.
Oh.
Right, okay.
No, they're going to get more challenging.
Okay,
here we go.
I'm
Here we
ready.
go. Do you regret not getting married?
Oh, wow.
Do I regret not getting married? I think it works like this. One of the really big things you have to try and work through and discern is whether in joining a monastic community that's possibly one of the really big renunciations in a way, so you have to sort of try as much as you can to be aware of yourself and whether that is something you're going to be able to live with.
Mm-hmm.
But always, with something like, you're trusting that if you take that step, that God's grace is there. You're going to, there's a grace that is given. I would say, talking, with chastity, we pray for the grace. It's not just about sort of working it through in your own strength. You can't do that. So I would say it is one of possibly the biggest decisions you had to make, was whether or not I could live a way of life where a relationship in marriage, and everything that involved, was no longer an option. So, but that, having done that, believing in my heart that this way of life was where the Lord was calling me, it was believing that the Lord's grace would be there. It's believing that in that way of life I could really grow and flourish. And that if I remain faithful to that calling, then, as you mentioned, Jo, the Lord wouldn't be possible for me if I'd been a married man. I have to say that. You're in a position, really, very privileged position, where you can have relationships, your friendships, with people that I don't think it'd be possible if I wasn't in this way of life, because of the type of life it is, and who I am as a person, as a monk, as a priest. There's a privileged access to people's lives, really, that wouldn't have been possible, I don't think, otherwise. So it is a big decision, but it's one where if you give myself, I've always felt if I gave myself generously to this way of life, that the Lord would be there.
Yeah. So in this day and age, quite difficult for people to commit to things for life.
Yeah.
Have there been moments when you thought, it's time to jump ship?
I have, Jo. Yeah. Well, you have experiences where you sometimes, maybe, in those early years before I'd committed myself, there were times when I really did think to myself, is this really what you sense the Lord calling you to do? Is this really the right place? And so on. So those sort of questions. Have I ever felt that? There have been times, I'd say, where I've sometimes thought, gosh, for various reasons, that maybe this isn't where I now need to be. And how you work through that, I think sometimes is trying to discern what is going on here. What is this voice? Is this from the Lord or isn't it? So in those, the discerning those times, those moments, those experiences, you've got to be really careful. You're just being aware. Basic sort of teaching, spiritual direction. Never make a major decision about your life if you're in a difficult or dark place, because your vision is going to be impaired, your spiritual vision. So I think how I handled those things was really to just rely on one of his great monastic virtues of perseverance, just going with it and just giving things time, and hanging on in there at times. But yeah, so that's. Let's respond to that, Jim. Yeah.
Do you ever get sick of your fellow monks?
Yeah, I suppose it's like a family, isn't it, really? I pray for them all. I have a little prayer I say. This mustn't go back to Worth, by the way, okay? Everything in this room stays in this room, as they say, okay? So well, I've made my a little list of them, so I don't forget any of them, you see? They're here. And they've got their birthdays and things like that, so I try and remember them on their birthdays. But what I do is pray through my list each day, so praying the Lord's blessing on each of them. And I say a little prayer like this. I say, dear Lord, bless each and every member of the community. I say, and particularly those I struggle with. And I say, which is most of them. So I just offer up that prayer. But what? One thing you learn in community, actually, the problem's yourself. Actually, you sort of learn this, I guess. But it's about an honesty about yourself, really. And another way, another thing about this is you do learn that in fact it's actually only through the challenges, of how you're being called to actually give of yourself, and times you offer forgiveness, you seek forgiveness, you're trying to work at those relationships you find difficult. But it's only in that way, I think, that we can really grow. I sometimes thought, well, what if everyone in the community was exactly like me? And I think that wouldn't be a good idea. It wouldn't be a good idea, because I don't think that would enable me to grow. For one thing, I just get bored with being with them all if they're like me. But so I think there is something that's really important here, because it is, you don't, in a sense, like you generally choose your friends. And when you join the community, there'll be some people who you get on really well with very quickly. If you weren't in the community and you'd met them outside, you'd probably be good friends. The most of them, the majority of people, you build relationships over time as you get to know them. But there always would be in a community, I think, people who you really do struggle with, because you're just so, like sort of polar opposite, really. And then you really have to work at those relationships. But I do believe that it is often through those difficulties and those challenges that come that you're able to grow. Because if there weren't the challenges, you wouldn't be stretched. And as we know, take any of the virtues, really. Just take love. I mean, we can only grow, as we know, in love by being tested in love. We can only grow in humility by being tested in humility, and that's a dangerous one. We can only grow in patience by being tested in patience. So if we weren't given these opportunities or challenges, we would remain, I think, both, we would remain spiritually immature. So I try and see those challenges as opportunities as well. So, but because it's it's interesting. Interesting. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you one last question. Now, there might be some people in the room, Father Rod, who, perhaps there's a little niggle there. They're wondering about, what their calling is. There might be people in the room who perhaps, think it could possibly lead to religious life or monastic life or priesthood or in some other sense, quite a bit more of a kind of leap vocation, you know,
Yeah.
something radical.
Yeah.
How would you, what advice would you give them for how they might kind of know that that's their call, or take that kind of step to explore it?
Yeah, I guess I'd go back to my own experience there, Jo, because I know that sort of worked. I'm still trying. You never stop learning, do you? But I would say, well, the first I'd say is that I never had any idea that you know, in my early 20s, that, you know, 2 or 3 years later I'd have been in a monastery. So be prepared to be surprised by God. And for me, I think that it was a slow process over a year or two. But what I sensed, because I had this clear plan and vision of how my life was about to unfold. But what happened through that experience of being visiting the abbey and living in the community there, not the monastic community, the community of young people there, was that it really began to feel a real desire for prayer, for that relationship with the Lord. I think that experience that when I first visited Worth really began to open me to a growth in that desire. It's not just about prayer. Prayer is, if you like, the way we access that relationship with the Lord. So a growing love, really, and a desire to be with the Lord. But my first, and I'd say my primary vocation was a calling to priesthood, to serving. But I also was aware, I thought, there was a great desire for prayer. So what happened there was the coming together of two, if you like, two vocations, which was the call to the priesthood, but alongside that, this call to prayer. And it seemed to me that what was happening at the Abbey at that time, with a lot of different works going on and so on, ministries, that this could be the place where those two, what I felt, callings would come together. So what I felt as I began just to work this through was a sense, I was never sure of whether this was the right thing, but there was a sort of a peace there about it. And as I thought about it, it was something that I felt good about. You know, this felt good, this felt right somehow. So what I decided to do was to test it. And that testing meant taking that step of actually experiencing the life at much closer quarters. So for me, I would say, you know, it was something I hadn't expected to happen at all. But I think if we start to pray, I mean, I say to people sometimes, your prayer, it's a dangerous thing to do. You know, your life can change, you know, if you pray. And it will change, actually. I'm not saying it might. It will change if you really take prayer to heart, which is what it's about. For me, that change meant I moved out of my own plans and embraced what I felt the Lord was asking me to do. Well, it was an invitation, very much an invitation to do. And then having made that step, I think, yeah, having the opportunity to live that life was that peace for me. There's nothing like a honeymoon in religious life. I mean, some people seem to enjoy that. I don't think it's such a thing as a honeymoon. I mean, it's meant to be challenging, you know. But I remember one point, getting to the point where I felt I could have actually left with what happened. I could have left. But I decided no. I went back to that real initial, if you like, experience and discernment of really sensing that the Lord was calling me. So I wasn't going to allow what happened at that particular time to allow me to give it up at that stage. So I think it's being sensitive, it's having the courage if one felt somehow the heart stirring in a particular way, a desire to serve in a particular way, whether religious life or priesthood, having the courage to follow that up, having the courage to step out in faith. And I think what will happen is there'll be a growing sense of peace about that calling in a person's heart. But not to dismiss it, not to think that it's something really just crazy, really. Or I couldn't possibly do it. That's the other fear. How could I possibly give up everything and do this? I want to do this, that, and the other. I think it's having the, just being aware of those fears that they can block. They can block you really discerning. So I'd say have the courage to listen deeply to your heart, and talk to people. Speak to people about it. Don't be afraid of sharing about it. Pray about it. Talk to people who are living the life. So that's all part of the discernment.
Thank you for all of that. That's marvellous. Very good. It was great fun to agree.